Hello, everybody. This is Catholic Dad, episode number 282. The Patriarchy is Garbage. I was reading a book review on an economist, a Nobel laureate economist, by the way. The book is called The Great Escape by Angus Deaton, is his name. And it essentially describes the transition from an agrarian or a farming society to an industrial society. And it has quotes from a lot of people during that time when they went from being farmers to being mill workers and factory workers, putting in those 14-hour days under the capitalistic corporate system. And it described the size and the weight of the human beings back then, back in England, that they were much smaller, they were much more frail, they had a lot less weight. And the economist essentially made the statement that the survival, if a man were 6 feet tall and 200 pounds back then, his chance of survival was virtually nothing. Because everybody was starving back then. Virtually everybody did not have enough food to sustain themselves. And even made the comment, 20% of the people in England didn't have enough food to actually physically labor or work because they were dying of starvation. They didn't have the energy to actually move about, move weight, and do some labor. And they became paupers and beggars on the street. And any time a disease came along, whether it be measles, mumps, rubella, tetanus, typhoid, you name it, that they would die of it. They would die of these infectious diseases because they didn't have the immune systems to actually protect them from, succumbing to these diseases. But nonetheless, why is the patriarchy garbage? So we have a whole host of women today, young women in particular, that think that men have been holding them back for all of humankind, and women, they're finally coming of their own and realizing how great womankind can become because they're breaking the chains of the male patriarchy, and it's the males that are the problem. Well, so this book, The Great Escape, is really interesting because it describes that men were starving. They were living hand to mouth back then. Literally 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the average life expectancy of a man in the United States of America was in his early 40s. He would die. He'd die of diseases and starvation and so on and so forth. Women lived a little bit longer, but nonetheless, if there was not enough food around for a man to labor, then there certainly was not enough food for a woman to labor because 1/3 of her children would die of disease, whether it be infectious diseases, malnutrition, you name it. And therefore, by the way, if the man didn't have the physical energy to do a large amount of labor, the woman, the only energy she had to go in toward the welfare of the children. She couldn't go out and sit there, I'm going to go get a job and this baby's going to sit at home and I'll come home and feed it later. She could not physically do that. That was out of the question. And so this idea that man was, he's living, on his throne, smoking cigars and drinking whiskey and bourbon and giggling and laughing at the top of his capitalistic, throne as the women sit there and they're at home birthing babies and they're the sex slaves of their husbands or whatever they are. I mean, I've had feminists say, or I've heard feminists say that, marriage is just institutionalized rape. Give me a break. I much prefer this story. Throughout the human history, there was not enough food around up until perhaps the 1940s in the industrialized Western world. Up until that point in time, every woman and every man were concerned about their children just surviving, like literally living through childhood. That was a really big deal. And so that men and women actually had to live together and create appropriate gender roles where they can actually ensure the survival of the next generation. That's how life was. That's how hard life was. And so when you look at these obese college girls, looking at their YouTube videos and like flipping through their phone, just being annoyed and mad that men have been holding them back for so long, they have forgotten history. They have absolutely no gratitude for what their grandparents put into the survival of the next generation, or their great-grandparents, or their great-great-grandparents. Essentially, life sucked. It was difficult. It was hard, and nobody could have imagined that the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and the internal combustion engine could create enough food where people would no longer succumb to infantile diseases such as measles, mumps, and rubella, that we actually had enough nutrition where we had robust immune systems. And so the white male patriarchy, the male patriarchy in general, it's garbage, it's crap. People used to marry each other and work together. I much prefer that story, that man and woman actually bound to each other to create an environment that was most successful toward the survival of their children. I mean, if you think about it, think about this, right? We had literally all of recorded human history. Maybe it's 6, 7, 8,000 years, whatever it is, where people were living hand to mouth. Everybody was in a constant state of starvation until about 60, 70, 80 years ago, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, all the gender roles started changing. Women were able to storm the workforce. They're the majority of the college degrees, the majority of the advanced degrees, the majority of the medical degrees. I mean, I'm a physician, and my med school class back in New York had over 50% females that were graduating as physicians. You know, literally, a little blip in history, a little point in time when we finally have enough food, women rise right to the top, which tells you something, by the way, that men were not what was holding them back. It's essentially that nobody had enough food. Women will come into their own, and by the way, this proves another point, that if men were the oppressors, they could easily have oppressed the women, but they didn't. They allowed them to go out and enjoy the fruits of their labor and their energies and so on and so forth. And once they had enough food and enough energy, where they didn't have to worry about every single day about the survival of their children, they were able to accomplish great things, which is great for the world, by the way. So the patriarchy is crap. It doesn't exist. What held women back long before was nothing. They weren't held back. They were bound to their children and their very survival of the children. If you want to say that children held them back, I think you're a problem yourself. And so, therefore, don't believe that men are oppressing women. Men love their women. Men love women in society. They want them to achieve everything that they could possibly achieve. I'm a father of 3 daughters. I want my daughters to be as strong and robust as any one of my sons, and I want them to go out and conquer the world. I think that would be wonderful. It would be great for society and great for everything else. I would not want to oppress. I would not want to ever oppress any woman, and I don't think I've ever met a man that would want to oppress a woman. I just don't. But for that narrative that man has always been oppressing woman and woman's finally rising up, you know what? You spit on your grandparents, you spit on your great-grandparents because they worked together so you could survive, and that's really what life was about. And so the book is The Great Escape. It's by Angus Deaton, a Nobel laureate economist. Check it out if you want, but there's no such thing as patriarchy. What there is there's survival is what there is. So this is Catholic Dad making you think about it. Please like or subscribe, get the Mass, and pray the Daily Rosary. God bless you all.